Considered the historical events that gave rise to the world of the New Testament. We have considered just a brief overview of the Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right, to be seen together. We've considered three of those kind of major themes that are within the Gospels that unite them: the triunity of God, Jesus himself as God, and Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. And this now leads us to our first gospel, the Gospel of Matthew. Let's go ahead and get started together. Alrighty. So, overview of the Gospel of Matthew. Authorship, kata matheon. That's a fun word to say, right? According to Matthew. Now, this may seem insignificant, but we've talked briefly about this already, that each of our gospel writers, they are writing theological and historical accounts of Jesus, and they are writing it within their own style. We talked about this actually in the first week. I briefly touched on it in our previous lecture, but these gospels are written by certain people with certain interests. Now, this is written by Matthew. Matthew 9:9. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. So the author of this gospel, Matthew, is a disciple of Jesus. He's an eyewitness. He's a Jew. And not only that, he was a tax collector. Now, if you read especially the Gospel of Luke, tax collectors are disdained by the Jews because they essentially sold out to the Romans. But this is important because Matthew, if he was a tax collector, he would have been educated, he would have been able to read, and he would have been able to write. Well, you know what? It makes for a good biographer. And so he's like specially qualified in a sense to write this gospel. So he's a Jew, and who are his audience? Likely Jewish believers. Why is that? We saw a little example of this with Jesus' baptism. Matthew is very much focused on how Jesus is the fulfillment, brings to pass the promises of the Old Testament, how Jesus himself fulfills them. All right, you can see just a broad literary flow there. Jesus' time in Galilee is the predominant setting of the Gospel of Matthew. Date of composition. Matthew was likely composed before AD 70 since it references temple sacrifices and a 2 drachma temple tax. So let me just remind us here. So the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. Well, if Matthew and other gospel writers and even the book of Acts mention nothing about this event, that would have been absolutely catastrophic for them. It lends credence that these gospels in the book of Acts, they're probably written before that kind of ultimate destruction. If the temple is that important, it would have been essential for all of them, and it hasn't been destroyed. The fact that they don't mention that it's just as unlikely, right? So that's why many scholars favor that date. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started with our introduction. And what I'll do is just sort of work through each of these sections. I'll combine sections 2 and 3 just because of time, but we'll go ahead and go through this here. So, Matthew's introduction. So, Matthew begins with a genealogy of Jesus. And Mark doesn't do that, and Luke does not do that, and John does not do that. But Matthew does. Matthew begins with Jesus' genealogy, with a special focus on Abraham and David. So, why genealogy, right? Why begin with a family record, Matthew? And that's because in the Bible, genealogies establish credibility. The Bible is full of genealogies, especially if you read Genesis or Numbers, Chronicles. The Bible loves genealogies because it traces people backwards. And that's what happens with Jesus. Matthew 1:1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. We've talked about this a little bit already. The gospel writers are trying to demonstrate how Jesus is the fulfillment of these promises. Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham in Genesis 12, that his nations would be that his descendants would bless the nations. Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise made to David, that he would have a son on the eternal throne. So Matthew, from the start, he lays down his deck and says, this is who Jesus is. And related to that, so Matthew's intro, it stresses the continuity between the promises of the Old Testament and Jesus. So here's just three. Like there's more that could be listed. Isaiah 7:14, this promise of this virgin birth. Well, Matthew says Jesus fulfills this. Micah 5:2, the birth of the Christ in Bethlehem. Well, Matthew explicitly says Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Isaiah 43, hey, there's going to be a coming messenger of the Lord. And Matthew says, John the Baptist has come and he is laying the foundation for Jesus. And what else do we have here? His introduction also stresses that he's the Son of God. Jesus is the Son of God. We saw this a little bit with his baptism. His baptism demonstrates to the world that he is in relationship with his Father in the Spirit. And also, when Jesus is driven to the wilderness, there's this beautiful connection with Jesus, Israel, who failed in the wilderness as God's son, and then also Adam's failure in the wilderness in a sense, but Jesus does not fail. Glorious, glorious, glorious stuff. All right, so that leads us here to sort of this big, broad section of Matthew. So the heart of Matthew focuses on Jesus' teachings, his healings, and the demonstration of his authority as the Christ, the Son of God. So we can see here Matthew 5-7. This is the Sermon on the Mount, man. This is Jesus' major teaching statement. Who are the people of God? The people of God are a part of the kingdom. Matthew 5:3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then Matthew 7:12. I'm sure many of you have heard this, even if you're not a Christian. I'm from Riverside, but I remember I went to like my first 3 years of elementary school. I went to school in Fontana, and I remember even in Fontana they had a golden rule, and it was from this verse, Matthew 7:12. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Right? This ethic of do to people how you would want them to do to you. People are taking it from Jesus. And Jesus says this is the entire teaching of the law and the prophets. And that leads us here. I'm excited to talk about this. Matthew 16:13-20. This is so important. And this, again, you see this in the other synoptics too. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Matthew 16:15-16. Jesus said to them, Jesus says to his disciples, who do you say that I am? Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now, before we move on, I want you to take a second and think, what is the significance of Jesus being called the Christ? I mean, people use this in curse words all the time. You watch a Joe Rogan podcast and he hits you with a Jesus Christ, right? You work construction, which I did for a long time. People will often say, just Jesus Christ. But think about this. What is the significance of Jesus as the Christ? I'm going to take a drink of water as you think about that. I'm sure most of you did not think about it as you're watching me drink water because that was distracting. All right. So, the significance of Christ, what does that mean? Well, first, we need to understand the term. So, Christ means Messiah. So, if you've ever heard the word Messiah, that is the Old Testament word, literally meaning the anointed one. Very important word. You see this in Isaiah, you see this in Psalms. The Messiah is this anointed one, this person set apart for some great task. The word Christ is the New Testament equivalent of Messiah. This is very important because for Jesus to be called the Christ means that he is the fulfillment of these Old Testament promises describing a person who's going to come. So, the word Christ, I don't have a soapbox, but if I did have one, I would get on it. The word Christ is not Jesus' last name. It's not like, my name is Josh Pittman. It's not, you are the Pittman. No, Christ again, is the New Testament equivalent of the Old Testament word Messiah. And it is a title, Jesus the Christ. We shouldn't say Jesus, just merely Jesus Christ, like if it's a first name and a last name. Jesus the Christ. Again, Jesus is the fulfillment of these promises of the Old Testament. All right. So this leads us to this. The final section of Matthew records Jesus' arrest, his trial, crucifixion, resurrection, and commissioning. So Jesus' arrest, his trial, crucifixion, resurrection, these are presented as historical realities. Again, this is so important because you might find Christians who say they're Christians describe Jesus' death and resurrection purely in terms of like spiritual things or spiritual realities, and they are unquestionably. But the gospel writers present these events as real life situations. There was a man who really died on a cross and really beat death and appeared to other people. And this then leads us to the final part of Matthew, which is glorious. This is often referred to as the Great Commission. Matthew 28:18 through 20. Jesus commissions his disciples to make disciples. That's the big verb here, make disciples of the nations. How do you make disciples? You do this by baptizing and teaching. You make disciples by baptizing, make sure my hands, and teaching. Discipleship includes baptism and instruction. We see this here. And Jesus came and said to them, his disciples, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. The Great Commission, make disciples. How do we do that, Jesus? You baptize them in the Trinitarian name, and you teach them what I've commanded. It's glorious. And that leads us into our final kind of just thoughts here about Matthew. What are some takeaways, themes? Again, Matthew presents Jesus as the fulfillment of the messianic expectations. Who are you? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Again, Matthew presents Jesus as God. They worship him in Matthew 28:17. Who is worshipped? Only God is worshipped. Only God rightfully receives worship in the Bible, and Jesus receives that. And then lastly, and there's so much more we can say, right, about Jesus' teaching, his ethical statements, but big picture, as Christ makes disciples, the church makes disciples. So this commissioning, if you are a Christian, it is still bound on you and the church. We are called to make disciples, make little followers of Jesus through baptism and instruction. Beautiful. The Gospel of Matthew. And we'll go ahead and stop right here as we now transition to the shortest of the Gospels, the Gospel of Mark.